Hello and welcome back to another video on this channel. What I want to talk about today is the gameplay aspect of Shadowbringers. I have been wanting to talk about this for a long time, but the announcement of no ultimate finally sparked me to do it. Before we get into it, let me preface this by saying that I love FFXIV, Shadowbringers included. I think it's one of the best RPG experiences I've had, and the story is simply incredible. A story which I love, which I have probably made clear with the amount of videos I make about it. But just because I like the game does not mean I shouldn't talk about the negatives. Quite the contrary, in fact, it shows that you are passionate and you want changes. Regardless, I normally only prefer talking about the positive stuff, since that's the kind of vibes I want on my channel, but like I said, I really just want to talk about this. As the title suggests, the point of discussion for this one is the gameplay aspect of Shadowbringers and what me and many other people feel they got wrong. Because this video covers such a wide topic, I think the best course of action is to split this up into multiple segments and then arrive at a conclusion at the end. The biggest issue, in my opinion, is the leveling experience. What I mean specifically is the skills that you unlock as you level up. It doesn't feel as satisfying anymore until you reach the current expansion levels. This is because they have been pruning so many skills, and in some cases also shifted skills over to later levels. For example, Largess used to be a low level skill, but it's essentially temperance at level 80 now. Same with Duality and Bunshin on Ninja. To demonstrate what I mean, let's look at a job like Bard for example, and look at what they had up until level 50 each expansion. So, what's the point I'm trying to make here? It's that we keep getting less and less skills and unlocks as we level up, which is becoming an issue. By the way, this isn't specific to Bard or specific to just levels 1 through 50. I can show you a similar thing from level 50 to 60 on, say, Dark Knight, where the only skills / traits they unlock are Salted Earth, Plunge, Abyssal Drain and Cavern Spit. Out of these, Salted Earth and Abyssal Drain have been heavily gutted and aren't anywhere near as strong as they used to be, so it's really only 2 significant unlocks. If you want yet another example, I can show Machinist from 60 to 70, where they gain only 1 trait, 1 of Global, and an AoE skill. I'm just emphasizing that I did not have to pick a specific level range or a specific job for this. This problem is universal across every class in Shadowbringers, across all levels, from 1 through 70. What probably annoys me the most are the random gaps in levels. From 50 onwards, you are supposed to gain something new every 2 levels. But because they pruned stuff and couldn't replace all of them with something, you gain literally nothing and have to go another 2 levels without unlocking anything new. Add on top the fact that there's a lot of really gutted skills that don't feel anywhere near as good to use anymore within these levels. It just makes for this really lackluster leveling experience, where sometimes you unlock nothing, sometimes you unlock something mediocre, and maybe once in a blue moon you unlock a great skill or a trait. Now, I'm the type of a person who likes to offer solutions instead of just talking about why something is a problem. So what could be done to fix this? There's 2 ways that come to mind. One is a low effort band-aid solution, and the other is a more permanent fix, but takes more resources to execute. The quick solution is to just utilize old skills and traits. To give you an example, you could unlock Hawk's Eye early on with Bard, and then later on it upgrades into Raging Strikes, increasing the damage buff on it. Or if Dark Knight the Power Slash combo first and have it upgrade into the Soul Eater combo, increasing the HP and MP regenerated with the respective GCD skill from the combo as it upgrades. This would give the player, especially a new player that doesn't recognize these animations, a feeling of unlocking something exciting and new, even though it's identical in functionality. But the preferable long-term fix is to just do what WoW did with their level squish rework. Essentially, you just reduce the level cap to 50 and put all the content from A Realm Reborn through Endwalker between those levels. This change in WoW was received with a lot of positivity, so I think it could work wonders in FF14 as well, and I hope they consider this as an option for 7.0. But please also understand that this would be a massive project to undertake, so I would not expect it anytime soon. Hence, why I'm being realistic and saying 7.0 at minimum. Alright, so this one applies mainly to tanks and healers. In Shadowbringers, the developers wanted to get rid of some of the imbalance, particularly within the healer and tank roles, and also wanted to make it so that you wouldn't bring a class based solely on the damage contribution it can bring, and allow everyone to bring the same levels of utility. This meant giving all tanks and all healers very similar toolsets, with minor variations in skills here and there. The classes still do of course feel very different aesthetically, which is probably why the developers weren't that concerned about making this change. But I wouldn't say it's that great for gameplay. Each job as you level it up should offer a unique experience. They still do, but that feeling is diminished somewhat. Obviously Dark Knight and Warrior are the most egregious examples of this, but it can be felt on the other jobs too. My opinion on this is that I don't think they have swung too much the other way. You only need to make minor alterations to make these jobs feel distinct again. I think, at the very least, their core rotation should feel different in gameplay. If you can achieve that, I think people won't feel the homogenization as much, even if you decide to leave the utility stuff as it were. Essentially, we used to have more janky classes, but they felt really distinct. Now we don't have as much jankiness, but they feel too samey. There is probably a balance to go for here, and it's also definitely very subjective. For me personally, I prefer diversity over balance, within moderation of course. I'd say it was fine in Stormblood for example. Easy to learn, difficult to master. That is really healthy game design. Though of course not applicable to every game, though I do think it can fit within FF14. What I and many others have noticed in Shadowbringers is that despite them making jobs a lot easier to play across the board, there are still tons of players, even at higher levels, that just play plain terrible. And I'm not having high standards like, oh, you must press your buttons exactly at the time as you're supposed to. I'm talking about black mages above level 60 only using Fire 3, Blizzard 3 and Thunder 2, yes 2, bards that don't use their damage over times, or red mages who hardcast Impact into dual casted where Thunder/Arrow 2 in AoE, heal bots that only spam Cure 1 over and over in AFK when there's no damage, etc, etc. And I think the conclusion I've come to is that it really does not matter how easy you make the classes to play. There will still be monkeys that are too lazy to read the tooltips or put in even a minimum amount of effort and will always suck regardless. That's just how it is. Us human beings are lazy as fuck creatures by default and will try to get things we want with minimal effort. So I wouldn't be opposed to giving more jobs more ways to optimize their kits again. An easy example of the kind of design I want is something like the post 4.2 monk in Stormblood. It was very easy to get into, as there honestly wasn't much to the Stormblood monk. However, those who really wanted to put in the effort could go for the TK rotation to squeeze out a bit of extra DPS, and even within the TK rotation itself it had two variations, a much more chill variant, and a harder one. At the same time though, this didn't gain you that much extra DPS, at least not enough to matter arguably any content, but at least not normal content. Regardless, it was more damage and felt satisfying to do if you put in the effort to execute this rotation in a fight. Another example would be Stormblood Scholar, where you had the option to spend MP on Miasma 2 for more DPS, but this was risky as it cost you MP, though you could get that MP back through downtime and through energy drain uses. You also had both Feywind and Dissipation as tools you could utilize. If a fight had downtime, you could optimize uses on those for no DPS loss. Again, this didn't gain you that much extra, even less so because you are a healer, but it was something fun to optimize in a fight, seeing how many Feywinds and Miasma tools you could squeeze in reasonably. Or, if you want to go back even further in time, I think the Heavensward Dark Knight was a good example as well. What I'm trying to say is that I just want classes to have that little something extra I can take of advantage to push DPS, but not feel obligated to do so when playing casually. How fun a class feels to optimize definitely affects how fun it is to raid in this game. Sure, the content itself can be good, but the less you have to think and optimize on your class, the faster you are going to get bored of the fight itself. A big thing they have been doing in this expansion is making changes to classes that appear to make them more smooth, but it only has a harmful effect. This sounds really counterintuitive, so let me demonstrate what I mean with yet another example. The Ninja rework in 5.1 brought some much needed changes. They finally made Mudras a GCD, which means that you don't get punished as much anymore for having a higher ping, and just makes the class overall feel way less clunky. Plus, the ninjutsus feel really satisfying to do now, as they do a lot of damage, so they feel a lot more impactful, as they should be. But then they did some other changes. For instance, they made ninjutsu have 2 charges. The reasoning for this is pretty sound. Basically, because of the really low cooldown of ninjutsu, you were always pressured to press it on cooldown or miss losing a use. Here's the thing though. Giving it 2 charges made the entire ninjutsu system really simple, downright brain dead. Because in a 60-second window you have 3 ninjutsus. With Suiton having a 20-second timer, this means that literally all 3 of your ninjutsus will always be used for trick. 1 for Suiton to set it up, and 2 Raitons inside it. This makes the class incredibly monotonous to play, as there isn't much interaction with your kit in between trick windows. Similarly, Meizui used to be 60 seconds CD and Tenjijin used to be 100 seconds. They made both of these 2-minute cooldowns, so that you could always naturally use Tenjijin in every other trick window, followed into a Meizui for an extra Baba. Again, really good on paper, but Tenjijin used to be a very flexible tool. You could use it to set up a trick attack, you could use it within trick itself, or you could use it independent of trick if holding it would cost you a use. Because we didn't have 2 charges of ninjutsu, and because of its 100-second cooldown, it meant that it didn't always align with trick. It meant we had to play around Tenjijin a lot, based on trick timer and ninjutsu usage. And those two complemented each other really nicely and gave the class an active feel in between your trick windows. Now all of that is just gone. Lastly, Shadowfang. Oh man, I miss Shadowfang. Anyway, now that Shadowfang is removed, Ninja's core GCD rotation is effectively reduced to spamming 1-2-3 with the rare Huton refresh from Armor Crush. What all of this means in practice is that they removed so many core components from the class that it became incredibly dumbed down, as Ninja in between trick windows is even more basic than Warrior somehow, and even the trick windows themselves are completely static. This is a prime example of the kind of impact removing or altering just a skill or 2 can have on a class. These kinds of changes make them a lot less engaging to play, ergo you end up getting bored of content a lot faster. Hence why I think this is an important topic to discuss. Okay, so I'm giving healers its own segment here, because I think there is a glaring problem with the design the devs are going for. At its core, healers are supposed to be DPSing majority of the time. Why? Because A. They contribute a lot of damage to the party. B. It's incredibly easy and smooth to transition from DPS to healing to DPS to healing, etc. C. Many fights, especially raid content, have tons of extended periods of time where the boss does not do any damage and it's prime time to be DPS. You're probably thinking, well, this is really self-evident, of course healers are supposed to DPS, who are you explaining this to? Well, apparently to Square Enix, because they did not get this memo when they made Shadowbringers. And this is exactly the crux of this issue. I really do not understand why create a role that spends like 85% of its time dealing damage, and within that same role, make their damage rotation consist of spamming one button and a single 30-second dot. It boggles my mind, it really does. To clarify, I am not asking for them to bring back cleric stance or anything along those lines. I just want at least a little bit extra. Once again, Stormblood was pretty much fine. Another important thing is also the fight design itself. The fights should have more damage in them to make stuff more engaging to heal. This raid tier was decent, but as a whole there has been a severe lack of damage taken in this expansion, which makes the already dull healer role even more dull. But I have a segment dedicated to the raid content itself. Okay, so now that we've talked about the design on the jobs themselves, let's talk about the content itself. Now, I don't know how much of a hot take this is, but I did not find myself enjoying the 24-man raids in this expansion at all. I'm not talking just story-wise here, that's a separate video I plan on doing after 5.5 when the story is complete. But even as far as the gameplay goes, I did not enjoy the Neo raids anywhere near as much as the previous 24-mans. I never got so bored from running a 24-man as quick. To this date, I only did Copied Factory twice, and Puppet's Bunker only once. On the topic of EX trials, those have been pretty hit and miss too. My favorites this expansion were probably Memoria Misera and the Seed of Sacrifice. I actually quite enjoyed Ruby EX Phase 1 as well, but the second phase was really bad. The rest were pretty forgettable experiences honestly. I mean, Hades EX was pretty cool, but it quickly got super fatiguing because of all the cutscene time each pull. Though, to be fair here, I also didn't like most EX in Stormblood either. Personally, I think there are two reasons I find myself not enjoying EX as much. One is all the cutscene time. The cutscenes are definitely integral to the experience, but I think they should be cut out from EX entirely. They did it right with Seed of Sacrifice EX, but then brought back the cutscenes in Emerald for some reason. Being forced to watch these cutscenes every single pull I think is a big factor in making you grow tired of these fights faster. The other thing is that I think EX trials are perhaps a little too forgiving. The intensity of mechanics and the mechanics themselves I think are fine, but I think they could be tuned a bit better artificially. This means basically scaling up the damage a bit so that healing and mitigating is a bit more encouraged. Not by much, you don't want it to reach savage levels, but just enough that it matters. And also make the DPS check so that you can't win by dying over and over and over, and also make the mechanics a little more punishing. Once again, not as punishing as savage, but some EX are ridiculous with how much you can mess up and still win. I remember the first time we did Seed of Sacrifice EX, we one-shot it fully blind after we passed the ads, because you could just keep messing up mechanics and doing everything half-assed and still win without even breaking a sweat, and we still didn't see most of the fight. Now obviously we are at a lot higher skill level than this fight was designed for, but even for newer players, these EX are not giving that much of a challenge. I've seen it myself. The EX should be the bridge you gap to go into Savage, but as it is, I think it's not challenging enough to properly function as said gap. To give another demonstration of just how severely undertuned these EX trials are, my friend Tano and his group did Innocence EX on these item levels. Granted, it was really tight, and they are all really experienced raiders, but I don't think you should be able to pull off something crazy like that. Like, that's just ridiculous. Next, the raid content itself. I definitely have my own opinions on the Savage tiers this expansion, but these opinions can be a video for another time, as here I'm just trying to focus on things that people I talked to didn't like. For one, a thing a lot of people feel is that there isn't as much of a sense of progression anymore until the final encounter. I think the main issue is that the third fight isn't as distinctively harder as it used to be. Think back to tiers like Creator, Deltascape, Sigmascape, etc. and the difference between, say, A10S and Crusader, or Catastrophe versus Halicarnassus, etc. There used to be a clear jump from the second fight to the third fight to the final fight. With the last few tiers, it doesn't feel it gets much harder progressively until it spikes in the last fight. And with the last fight itself, it's usually super front-loaded. What I mean by this, the first phase of Titan was the hardest part of that fight, as was the first phase of Shiva, as was Eden's Promise. This is also a thing I'm not really a fan of. I myself prefer for a fight to have a natural difficulty curve, where it gets progressively harder and it peaks at the hardest mechanics. Front-loading can work, of course, but especially if you do it repeatedly, it starts to get a bit tiresome, because you get tricked into thinking this fight will be more difficult than it is. And also it means that they have to make the other mechanics afterwards a lot easier and more simplified to keep their overall desired difficulty for the fight. This leads into really dumb mechanics, like in Titan, where he just smashes a platform for almost a minute straight without anything happening, besides smashing some healer jails, or in Shiva, with the first Worm's Lament or the Ice Slide, or in E12S, where they had to make the second phase a lot easier to make up for the door boss being that difficult. Don't get me wrong, I love the final encounters of each raid tier. That has definitely always been consistently great. They always feel like great finales and epic encounters in Savage. But I think that they should just do away with this whole front load everything sort of a fight design. Though I do sort of get why they do that, because there has been issues in the past where first you had people being able to skip the hardest mechanic, like in, say, A12S, because it happens right at the end, hence you can skip it if you just get geared enough and do enough damage. Then, in Stormblood they address this by having the fight climax in the middle of the fight, then just repeat the pattern, which some people didn't like. So now in Shadowbringers, they went for this design instead. As for which one of these is the best way to go about it, it's very subjective, of course. I personally think we could always just have a mixture of all of these, like vary it up a bit between raid tiers, keep the design philosophy fresh every time, instead of locking yourself into doing it one specific way. Another thing is just random undertuning. Some DPS checks were randomly super easy, like E4S, E7S and Oracle, and in Eden's Verse, they somehow made stuff deal way too little damage. Oh, and the cutscene nonsense that started to bleed into Savage 2, specifically E1S and E8S, which I definitely don't think is a good idea. Putting a cutscene that removes control from your character in the middle of a fight, and having to see that repeatedly as you proc the fight, that's just really annoying. Finally, let's talk about Ultimate. Alexander Ultimate is probably the worst offender to the thing I talked about with front loading, but I think it was a great ultimate nonetheless. Same as the final encounters in Savage, I love ultimates, they feel amazing to prog and clear, and that will probably never change, so I really don't have much to complain about when it comes to the design of the ultimates themselves. Rather, this will be a discussion of the impact that lacking an ultimate has. First off, I want to address a point that some people have made, either saying that ultimates aren't worth the time for developers to make due to only a very small number of players doing it, or that they are happy not having an ultimate so their resources go elsewhere. I think this is a really bad stance to have, because a community where people only care about the content they themselves are interested in isn't a very healthy one, I don't think. Besides that, ultimates do have their place in FF14, and it's definitely worth for them to make. Here's why. The most obvious benefit of an ultimate is the attention it brings. Every time an ultimate is progged, FF14 gains a lot of attraction on Twitch, or at least comparatively to what it normally does. This means more people get interested, more fresh blood join the game. But besides that, these hardcore players, though much smaller in number than casual players, are still very much players you want to have around and keep satisfied. This is for the simple fact that this hardcore portion of the community is the most loyal part of your player base. They are the best candidates for playing your content, doing tier crafting, as well as they have more influence over player retention, as these are the people that generate the most hype and interest in the game, as it's the hardcore player base that produces most content related to the game, like videos, streaming, guides, discussion, and so on and so forth. So, for those of you that are saying that they intentionally want to cut hardcore raid content to instead focus purely on casuals, please drop this argument, because it's completely nonsensical, frankly. It is in the developer's best interest to satisfy the hardcore player base, as you need this kind of content to be the cornerstone of this game to keep it healthy, even if a small portion end up actually participating in clearing said content. For this reason, it's a lot more sensible to assume they drop the ultimate out of necessity, rather than making it an intentional calculated risk to drop it. Furthermore, cutting the ultimate also has a sort of a cascading effect on other pieces of content. People who were playing the current raid tier actively were doing so because they were anticipating an ultimate, so it was a carrot for them to keep playing. First of all, to not get rusty, but also keeping the group together until then, as well as gearing up jobs in preparation for the ultimate. Now that we know there won't be one, I saw tons of people immediately either disband or put their statics on hold until the expansion, most of those people completely unsubbing, because there just isn't as much reason to do that here anymore. So the ultimate being removed had a big impact on the life cycle of this raid tier, and keep in mind that this raid tier is the only high-end content we are getting till the next expansion. It's supposed to last almost an entire year, but without an ultimate, people won't stick around with this tier for that long. It just cannot carry the content enough to do so, since we've now had a taste of an ultimate 3 times. So simply having a savage tier to hold us till the next expansion simply doesn't cut it anymore. And after the raiding community goes, as I said before, you risk losing a lot of quality players, and thus the retention drops. This is why it's important to look at the ultimate and what impact it has in the bigger picture. Besides this, another thing that Shadowbringers messed up is that the older ultimates are really poorly balanced. Now, obviously it was to be expected that with all the reworks and changes to jobs, the old ultimates wouldn't stay 100% faithful, but the extent to how powerful you are is pretty insane. It legit feels like you have Echo in there now. What this does is that it makes the prior ultimates feel a lot less desirable as well, meaning the only properly hardcore content we have had until now and will have until 6.1 is Alexander Ultimate. So to kinda return back to the topic of this video, my point with this segment is to say that this expansion has definitely felt more lackluster when it comes to raid content and keeping raiders satisfied. Don't get me wrong, there are definitely positives to talk about as well. For example, the general response to the way they handled Bozia seems to be really positive this time around, and both Delubrum and its Savage version are praised a lot by the community. Plus, we can't forget all the quality of life improvements and crafters/gather improvements, and things of that nature. But in spite of all that, no matter where I go, I'm only seeing people being dissatisfied. You could say it could do with the fact that I know mostly only raiders, which is definitely a part of it, but I also know people that don't raid that also came up with some of these same complaints. To bring the video to a closure here, I realize most, if not all of this stuff I talked about is really apparent. The idea I had with this video was more to just compile all the grievances that people have expressed throughout the expansion and spark some discussion on the matter. Anyhow, I oughta not drag this video on for much longer. I hope you enjoyed, and as usual just drop a sub if you want to stick around this channel, and with that, I will wish you all a nice day.